In the winter of 1838, the United States government forced 70,000 Native Americans off their land at gunpoint. They were made to walk hundreds of miles through freezing temperatures with no adequate food, no adequate shelter, and no choice. 4,000 of them died on the march. Men, women, children, and elders, dead on the road, buried in graves that their families could not mark and could not return to. The man who ordered this was Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States. And for nearly 200 years after he gave that order, his face appeared on the $20 bill in the wallets of every American who ever bought groceries or paid a taxi or gave their grandchild a birthday gift. This is the story they put on the money and the story they left off it. To understand what happened on the Trail of Tears, you have to understand what was taken. The Cherokee Nation in 1830 was not a primitive tribal society living in the wilderness. It was a sophisticated, self-governing civilization with its own written constitution, modeled in part on the United States Constitution. It had its own Supreme Court, its own elected legislature, its own school system, and its own free press. The Cherokee Phoenix, the first Native American newspaper in history, published in both English and the Cherokee language. The Cherokee had done everything that American society asked of them. They had adopted written governance. They had built farms and schools and churches. They had signed treaties with the United States government, legal agreements that guaranteed their right to remain on their land in perpetuity, treaties that bore the signatures and seals of the United States government and were therefore, by the law of the United States, the supreme law of the land. Andrew Jackson did not care about the law of the land when the land in question had gold on it. And when gold was discovered in Georgia on Cherokee territory in 1829, the year before Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, the outcome was never really in doubt. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 passed Congress by a narrow margin. It was controversial even then. Congressman Davy Crockett of Tennessee, one of the most famous frontiersmen in American history, voted against it and lost his congressional seat partly as a result. He said he would rather be beaten than be responsible for such an act. He was beaten. The act passed anyway. The act gave Jackson the authority to negotiate removal treaties with native nations, to offer them land west of the Mississippi in exchange for their eastern homelands. What it did not authorize, at least according to the Supreme Court of the United States, was forced removal. In 1832, the Supreme Court ruled in Worcester versus Georgia that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community with sovereign rights to their territory and that the state of Georgia had no authority over Cherokee land. The ruling was clear. The law was clear. The Constitution was clear. Andrew Jackson is reported to have responded. John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. The President of the United States looked at a ruling by the Supreme Court of the United States protecting the rights of Native American people and decided he simply would not follow it. And because the army answered to him and not to the court, he was right. Nobody enforced it. In 1838, United States Army soldiers and Georgia militia began rounding up Cherokee families from their homes, not from camps or nomadic settlements, but from houses, from farms, from the kinds of ordinary domestic environments that the Cherokee had built over generations. Families were taken in the middle of meals. They were not allowed to gather their possessions. They were put into stockades, temporary holding camps, where they waited in overcrowded and unsanitary conditions while the logistics of the forced march were organized. Then they walked. They walked from their homeland in the southeastern United States to what is now Oklahoma. The route covered approximately 1,000 miles, depending on which path was taken. They walked through the summer heat, and then through the autumn, and then, in the worst conditions, through the winter of 1838 to 1839, a winter that was unusual unusually harsh, even by the standards of the American interior. Temperatures dropped to extraordinary lows. Snow fell, the ground froze, they walked with insufficient food. The contractors hired by the government to supply food and equipment along the route were corrupt and inadequate. Food that was promised did not arrive. Blankets that were promised did not arrive. Medicine that was promised did not arrive. People died of dysentery, of pneumonia, of exposure, of starvation. Children died. Elders died. Pregnant women died in childbirth on the road with no shelter and no care. Burial parties followed the march. They buried people along the road, in unmarked graves across Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas. 4,000 people buried on the road to somewhere they had never chosen to go. The Cherokee called what happened to them Nuna Daul Tsuni, the trail where they cried. In English, it became the Trail of Tears, a name so understated for what it describes that its inadequacy is almost its own commentary on how history chooses its language. But the Cherokee were not the only people who walked. The Indian Removal Act was applied to 5 major native nations in the American Southeast: the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. Together, they are sometimes called the 5 civilized tribes, a term the United States government used because these nations had most fully adopted the specific elements of European American civilization that white society valued: written government, Christianity, English literacy, sedentary agriculture. They had done everything they were told to do. They were removed anyway. The Choctaw were removed first, beginning in 1831. The Choctaw chief George Harkins wrote a letter before the removal that was published in American newspapers, addressed to the American people. He wrote that his people were about to make a sacrifice of their homes and of country that they loved, not because they wanted to, but because they had no alternative. He called it a feeble remnant of a noble race. His people walked in the winter without adequate clothing. Hundreds died. Andrew Jackson called Indian removal a generous policy. He said it was an act of kindness, saving native peoples from the inevitable conflict that their presence in the southeastern United States would otherwise have caused. He said it with complete apparent sincerity, the specific sincerity of a man who has arranged his moral framework so that what benefits him also benefits his victims. He died in 1845 at his plantation called the Hermitage in Tennessee, a plantation that was worked by enslaved people, surrounded by the comforts of a life built on the dispossession of others. He died wealthy and celebrated, and was mourned as a great American president. In 1869, his face appeared on United States currency for the first time. In 1928, it moved to the $20 bill, where it stayed for nearly a century. In 2016, the Treasury Department announced that Harriet Tubman, the abolitionist who freed enslaved people, would replace Jackson on the $20 bill. The announcement was welcomed. The new bill was supposed to appear in 2020. It did not. The redesign was delayed. As of 2026, Andrew Jackson remains on the $20 bill, the man who ordered the Trail of Tears, on the money still.
The descendants of the people who walked the Trail of Tears are alive today. The Cherokee Nation, with its capital at Tahlequah, Oklahoma, is the largest federally recognized tribe in the United States, with a current enrollment of over 400,000 citizens. They have a functioning government, a university, a hospital system, and a thriving economy. They publish their own newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, still. The same newspaper that existed before the removal is still being published by the same nation in 2026. They survived. Everything that was done to end them did not end them. The language is still spoken. The ceremonies are still conducted. The government still functions. The newspaper still publishes. The people are still here. If this story made you feel something, if the weight of it landed somewhere real inside you, please hit like right now. This story deserves to be known by every American who has ever held a $20 bill. Subscribe to this channel because every week we tell the real story, the full, honest version, that the history books summarize in a paragraph and move on from, as if 4,000 people dying on a road is something you can move on from in a paragraph. Share this with someone. Anyone who went to school in America and learned about Andrew Jackson as a hero deserves to know this other part of the story. And comment below, one word. How did this make you feel? I read every single one. Until next time, Nuna Daul Tsuni, the trail where they cried. Remember it.